Meanwhile, South Africa's G20 presidency has put the issue of Africa's debt and debt costs on the agenda for the grouping. The G20 has a common framework for debt treatments already, but this has been criticized as being inadequate and too slow. Bronwyn Seaborn sat down with Elizabeth Sidiropoulos, the CEO of the South African Institute of International Affairs, to ask her about how the G20 can be used to address issues around debt for Africa.
I think debt is one of the biggest challenges that are on the G20 agenda. And of course, it's interrelated with a whole host of other issues, whether you're talking about climate finance or you're talking indeed about the cost of capital more broadly. The common framework emerged out of COVID, following the debt service suspension initiative. And it was really intended to be a much more comprehensive framework and long-term rather than the sort of interim measure that was implemented in 2020. But as you quite rightly point out, it hasn't actually dealt with the big problem of debt. And a country like Zambia sort of battling for 3.5 years. And so the one problem is, of course, the time it takes. But it is about the working methods, so to speak, of the common framework that presents some of the problems. The point that it is about sequentially sort of, dealing with creditors. The fact that this debt crisis, compared to the one that we had 25 odd years ago, is a much more complex one, because previously you had the Paris Club, who were the large debtors. Now you have the Paris Club, you have private creditors, of course, and then you have the new creditors like China, the Gulf states, and so on. So it becomes much more complicated to navigate. They are not all coming into these discussions with a common framework, ironically. One of the points, for example, that a country like China has flagged is, well, what about multilateral development bank debt? They are seen as the superior creditors. It's not part of the discussions, even though they are certainly the IMF is one of the co-chairs of the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable, which this year South Africa co-chairs as the chair of the G20. So, and in addition, it's really focusing on the low-income countries, not the middle-income countries, and the middle-income countries are also problematic. They also have challenges around debt. So all of these issues require, some would argue, a complete reassessment and restructuring of the common framework to address some of these issues. That's not going to happen. But at the very least, there is a sense that the negotiations need to be far more rapid. There is some discussion around possibly including middle-income countries, but I think the geopolitical context makes any significant reforms of the common framework very difficult. And we saw that, in fact, also in the conversations that were had in SAIIA with on the fourth Financing for Development conference around that very issue.
Is it a case of just too many voices coming to the table? Because there has been others suggesting that it is a far better and far smoother process if countries are almost in it alone, negotiating directly with their creditors, and we should actually be moving away from these collectives.
So the common framework is very much about, it is the bilateral. The problem there is the creditors tend to always have more information than the borrower, which is why I think it's been such an important consideration, and it made it into the Seville document, to actually create a borrowers forum where countries can coordinate. It's not about negotiating collectively. Clearly, you can't really do that, because each country has individual context, and the composition of its debtors, of its creditors might be very different. But if you are actually coordinating and hearing about the ways in which your individual creditors are also engaging with you on the negotiations, it creates more information is critical. And it creates also an opportunity and a platform for taking perhaps individually collective action. So if we're all going to our individual creditors and saying, well, this is what we think this problem, this is the way we think this should be tackled. And they're hearing it across the board because there is coordination. We know what each other is doing. Then that actually gives those countries greater agency. But it's in the Compromiso de Sevilla, which came out of the FFD4. It's now a matter of really driving that forward, because that, I think, is an important contributor to sort of ensuring that the bilateral negotiations actually happen within a framework, but happen within a framework where there is information, there is data that we can share as debtors.
We talk about the importance of the collective, and yet it coming at such a time where there is a real sense of we're all just looking out for ourselves. Obviously, very subtly hint at the moves that we see taking place in the United States. And we talk about what needs to happen with this framework. We talk about the G20 coming together and why it's so important that this collective happens. And yet we are going to hand over to the US at the end of this year, and they take over the leadership of the G20. Are we really at risk of losing some of these gains, particularly on important issues like this, the cost of capital and debt for Africa, when we do hand that over? Are you concerned about that?
So, of course, one has to be concerned. And it's something that I think plays on the minds of everybody who's been involved in the G20 this year. I think it's important to make the point also that there is a sense among the G20, the other G20 members, and also the guest countries that are part of the discussions, and indeed the EU and the AU, that the importance of this G20 is about showing that international cooperation, multilateralism can work, and that we're all committed to it. So in our engagement with the G20 process over the course of several months, that has been repeated repeatedly. The challenge there is to make sure that we can show some outcomes, some outputs through the leaders' declaration at the end of the year, which then countries, because at the end of the day, this is not a formal treaty agreement or anything. It's the collective action of the G20 members, that those who can in the global economic governance fora can actually drive some of those things forward, regardless. Clearly, the issue of what the US is going to do with the G20 next year is going to be a much more pared down G20. It's going to focus on issues that are close to this administration's heart. It's going to be about deregulation. It's going to be about tariffs and trade. That invariably is going to happen. But that's and it would have been difficult anyway, because the US holds, in some institutions, as we know, holds veto power in effect because of its shareholding. So some of the things that require changes to rules and that kind of thing would be a problem anyway. But I think the approach that one must take is that the G20 is not just about 1 year. Indeed, any of the international processes are not just about 1 year. They are about building incrementally, and at some point, some of these things will come to fruition. So the approach we need to take, and I think we are taking, with, say, for example, the work that former Minister Trevor Manuel is doing with the African Experts Panel, is to produce that report. Sure, that report may not go anywhere in the course of next year, but it is there. It's part of the formal record. It can be picked up in subsequent years. It also doesn't mean that because the G20 next year might not be interested in it, that you can't continue to advocate, to create greater awareness, to try to build coalitions in other fora on some of the issues that may come out of that study. It's the same with some of the outcomes of the Development Working Group a few days ago at the Ministerial, where they adopted a document on combating illicit financial flows. It's about high-level principles. The idea is to commission a study that will develop a set of roadmaps that can be implemented at national level to counter illicit financial flows. That will only be presented at the end of next year, in December, in fact. And so, that can then be taken forward in subsequent years. So that would be the approach. I think next year is going to be a very different G20, never mind on the issues of cost of capital. But the fact that the South African presidency has created a platform and the space to really project some of these discussions more widely, I think cannot be underestimated and should not be allowed to stop on the 30th of November.